Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the Guilty as Charged podcast. My name is Steven, and I am the host, as always, and we are presented by the Chargers Podcast Network. Of course, joining me is my guy, Tyler. Tyler, what's up, man? How you doing today?
I am doing fantastic. I'm on cloud nine. No handstands, though. I can't do that again. I was sore for a whole week.
Yeah, we had to have worked up to that point. You know, now you got a little hamstring strain, whatever the case may be. You know, and it was a one-time thing. So, exciting news again today to get into today for this episode. This is obviously one of the more exciting week stretches for Chargers and Chargers fans, and we'll get into some of that. First and foremost, Tyler and I are fans of the team, just like you guys are. The opinions that we express on this show are just that. They are our opinions, not the opinions of the organization themselves. We're very grateful for this platform to express these opinions. And that being said, Tyler, let's dive in. None of this is officially official as of recording this on Monday night, January 29th. But according to Ian Rappaport and several other insiders, the Chargers are believed to be hiring Joe Hortiz, the Ravens director of player personnel, as their new GM. I think this is, again, a great move. We've talked a lot about alignment and synergy, and certainly somebody who's worked with Jim Harbaugh's brother for the better part of 2 decades will be able to have that kind of philosophy alignment that we are looking for. So, Tyler, that being said, your reaction here to Joe Hortiz and this news that it's kind of trending towards him becoming officially the new GM?
Yeah, this would be fantastic for the Chargers. When we spoke about lessons learned from the past 11 years and what we can take moving forward, 2 of the things that I mentioned were acquiring draft picks, whether that's trading back in the draft or comp picks. And the other thing I mentioned was just alignment from general manager and player acquisition all the way through the coaching staff. And I think the Chargers get that here with Hortiz, should they make this the official hire. And he comes from one of the best organizations in football. If you're just looking at draft success, since he was the director of college scouting for the Ravens have been third over that span in draft success. The Chargers have been, cover years, everybody, 32nd over that same span. I mean, they're going to get a significant upgrade here where it really matters. And Michigan defensive coordinator Jesse Minter pointed out that at the epicenter of both Baltimore and Michigan's programs was player development and how important that was for them. And Michigan, obviously, it's worked for them. They won the national championship. And the Ravens, that's the same case as well. The Ravens have 8 players who have made the Pro Bowl or All-Pro this season. 7 of those players they brought in. It was their draft picks or an undrafted free agent. The only one who wasn't was Roquan Smith, who they traded for. It is about homegrown talent and developing those players. It's one thing to just take the talented player. It's another thing to make that player into what they should become, what they're projected to become. And beyond that, too, we talked about comp picks. The Ravens are the kings of comp picks. The Chargers, since 2014, up until now, had only 7 comp picks. The Ravens had 22. That is 22 free swings at the ball and at bats for the Ravens. That's incredible. The Chargers have needed that, and they're going to need that because Justin Herbert, this contract, it's no longer a rookie contract. It's now an expensive contract. So the Chargers need to make sure that they hit on these draft picks. It's going to be everything that Jim Harbaugh wants. And the one thing we talked about, we could, put one candidate against another, resume versus resume, fine. But the number one most important thing for us was alignment to the head coach. Since that head coach is Jim Harbaugh, and Hortiz seems to be a very natural connection for him, that synergy from decision-making up top to player development, to coaching, to scheme, to philosophy, to fit, to identity, that's all there now. The Chargers are going to be so much better should they choose to make this move, and I'm really excited.
Yeah, I think that synergy is extremely important, and one of the ways that we've kind of tried to parcel through this GM cycle is how much stock do you put into relationships built with Jim Harbaugh over the course of several decades ago, whether it was Ed Dodds and his direct relationship with him from when they were in Oakland together. Brandon Brown had the connection, the Giants assistant GM, obviously, that Albert Beard pointed out. Ian Cunningham worked for the Ravens. The Chargers were interviewing GM candidates, and it was like, if you have Harbaugh experience, like, that's a plus, but it was not obviously a prerequisite. But Joe Hortiz has spoken the Harbaugh language for the better part better part of a decade. He's learned from Ozzie Newsome. He's learned from Eric DaCosta. And everybody says that the roster building is a collaborative process, but nobody exemplifies that better than the Baltimore Ravens, in my opinion. And the biggest part about being a general manager, in my opinion, is finding ways to give your teams advantages within the margins. Because I think for the most part, like, the coach, his job is to win on game days, right? But everything else, from a roster building standpoint, it is the GM and his responsibility. And can you find those comp picks? Can you trade down? Can you hit on undrafted free agents? Can you sign some veteran contracts to minimum deals, and they just over exceed their value? And you mentioned just from 2012, the Ravens in history of compensatory picks have 53 total compensatory picks. Second place on that list is the Green Bay Packers with 43. That's 10 extra just for no reason. The Chargers in the history of compensatory picks, for what it's worth, like Tyler mentioned, only have 14 total. So it's a huge difference, and it's a huge advantage that can give you those extra picks. So I think his background in working in those margins is going to be a huge plus for the Chargers. I would be pretty surprised if the Chargers make all of their scheduled draft picks at this point, given where Joe Hortiz is coming from, and we can dive into that here in a little bit. But it's just a flexibility aspect for me. He has such a flexible background of pulling from draft day trades, in-season acquisitions, veteran minimum contracts, compensatory picks, everything you could possibly want. The Ravens were always about like checking off every single box and looking for advantages everywhere that they could possibly find. And like you mentioned, the Chargers are entering into this cap transitional period where they have a lot of expensive contracts. Justin Herbert is going to be very expensive starting next season. And so having a GM who comes from this kind of background is going to be super, super important.
And what about the two of the things that have really hurt the Chargers this past season? That'd be the run game and, of course, the defense. I think bringing in someone who's overseen the Baltimore Ravens and that run game, granted, Lamar Jackson has a lot to do with that, but still, the run game, the tight ends, the fullback, that's going to be super helpful. And then, of course, the defense, be able to build both of those two things to help out Justin Herbert. Lost in all of this, we talk about the coach, we talk about GM, we talk about all that. But John Spanos came out and said the number one priority is Justin Herbert. And by extension, sure, it could be Brock Bowers at 5, and it might be Brock Bowers at 5. And if you want to hear about Brock Bowers at 5, go see our last episode. But it's also about that run game. It's about that defense. And I think finding someone who has experience building those two things very, very strong, like if you feel pretty good as a Chargers fan, it's been a great week.
Yeah, it totally has. Joe Hortiz, we did our GM rankings, and Joe Hortiz was not at the top. We prioritized that assistant GM experience and things like that. But there were so many great candidates in this GM cycle, and Joe Hortiz was definitely one of them. So this isn't like, I feel like they're settling by any means. I think this whole thing was about alignment. This is about finding a guy who can speak Harbaugh and also find, just how to, take advantage of these different areas. So I want to talk specifically about their trade history on draft weekend, because this is going to be something that is going to be very different for us as Chargers fans over the last few years and what we're used to. And I think there's a specific quote out there from Hortiz about size and lack thereof, or fitting a certain physical profile. And his quote was, "You got to pay attention to it, but all players are different. You don't want to knock a guy because of a previous player." So he really has that flexible mentality, and let's adapt to the certain player. Let's grade the prospect, not the helmet, as Jordan Reed of ESPN always likes to say. And that pans out into their draft history. And just like, I found this article dating back to 2016. And since then, they have traded back into the first round to get Lamar Jackson. They traded Hollywood Brown to the Cardinals for a first round pick, which they then parlayed into more picks by trading down from that spot to select Tyler Linderbaum. They traded Orlando Brown to the Chiefs and selected Odafe Owe and Ben Cleveland with the return. They traded up on day 3 for tight end Charlie Kolar. They traded up in the draft in the second round for Justin Madubuike. They originally traded down 3 spots to acquire Hollywood Brown originally. They traded down twice in 2018 to select tight end Hayden Hurst. And with those returns, they were able to trade back up to get Lamar Jackson. They traded up in the third round for Mark Andrews. They traded down in the second round for Matthew Judon. They traded down again after that in the same draft to take Kamalea Correa. This is their entire draft history. They trade down, they trade up, they move around, they move down twice, they move up twice. They are so flexible and active on draft weekend, and it's about finding those advantages. And it seems like every time they do that, they still end up taking the player that they were originally going to take and hit a home run with those players. And if it's not a home run, they're still a really good player. And then they leave in free agency, and then they get compensatory picks, and around and around and around we go for the Baltimore Ravens on draft weekend. It's going to be such a treat to see how Joe Hortiz approaches this particular draft with the 5th overall pick. And does he want to take one of the blue chip players? Does he want to trade down and still take a really high end player and take 2 second-round players? It's going to be fascinating. This adds so many different layers to draft weekend because his background is of a chess player, essentially. This is a guy who's going to move around the board as much as he can and try and make as many picks as he can and give his team as many advantages as he can. And that, to me, as a draft nerd, is extremely exciting to think about all the different possibilities that Joe Hortiz can cook up.
Yeah, the Chargers have given up the equivalent of the 18th overall pick in the draft based on trades up for players. The Baltimore Ravens and what they've been able to do, the idea that the Chargers could do something like what they've done, like the imagination and the process that you talked about, that you mentioned there, is awesome to hear. I'm really excited for this one. Should it happen, of course, but all things are trending that way.
Yeah. Again, we're recording this on Monday night. Ian Rappaport seems to believe that is going to be that way. So by the time you're listening to this, it might have already become official. Who knows? It is Monday night. All right, Tyler, any other thoughts about Mr. Joe Hortiz?
That if you look at the Lions and the way that they've been able to become a contender, not necessarily overnight. It's been a lengthy process, of course, and they didn't start out great. But if you look at the way the Lions have drafted the last 3 drafts and really this past one with some of their difference makers, that could be the Chargers. I'm not saying that they'll go to the AFC Championship this year based on one class. It required several classes for the Lions. Yeah. But you can really turn things around very quickly if you hit on a couple of drafts or even one.
Yeah, we're going to expand upon that particular point here in a minute. So the other piece of news, again, according to Ian Rappaport, Tom Pelissero, and some Michigan insiders as well, the Chargers are expected to hire Jesse Minter away from Michigan to be their defensive coordinator. The Rooney Rule does apply here to defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator hires. It's just one candidate instead of 2. So the Chargers are still going to have to go through a search here to determine if Jesse Minter is the defensive coordinator. But again, it sounds like that is where we are trending towards. So this is, again, a really fantastic move by Jim Harbaugh. Obviously, there's the continuity. There's familiarity of him being at Michigan over the last 2 years. He was in Baltimore along with Joe Hortiz and all those guys. So this is, again, it's the alignment, it's the philosophy, it's the belief, and it's the trust in his ability to maximize the staff and those around him. So Jesse Minter has been a defensive coordinator the last 2 years at Michigan. He was a defensive coordinator at Vanderbilt before that, and worked in Baltimore, like I said. So a lot of alignment here, Tyler. What's kind of your initial thought as we look forward to what a potential Jesse Minter defense might look like in Los Angeles?
Well, I talked about acquiring players, right, and selecting the right players. Sure, you can do that. That's half of it. Now they have to go onto the field and develop. And as Minter pointed out in the quote I referenced earlier, Michigan was about development, and that player development was at the epicenter of their programs. And I think he absolutely backs that up. And Michigan and Jim Harbaugh have backed that up. If you look at the quote unquote talent metric, which measures, recruiting classes and compares recruiting classes, not that Michigan was a, D3 school by any means. I'm sure a lot of teams would kill to have the talent that they've had. But
Sure.
The last 3 college football champions before Michigan, in terms of talent metric, those 3 teams, Georgia twice and then Alabama, were both second in talent metric. And since 2015, when they kept track of talent metric, no other team has been, quote unquote, worse than 9th. These are all top 10 recruiting classes and overall groups. Michigan is the only one to rank outside the top 10 and win the national championship. They were 14th in talent metric, which again is not bad. That's a very, very good team, but they're still doing more with less. And that is so impressive. They went and beat Alabama, of course, and I'm sure they had a great recruiting class. Based on projections, it looks like Michigan's going to have 7 players be drafted this year. And of those 7 players, 4 of them were former 3-star recruits, 2 of them were former 4-star recruits, and the only one who's projected to be drafted that was a former 5-star recruit actually wasn't their recruit. He transferred from Alabama. So they've been able to take these players, and I'm just talking about defense here. And I'm not saying 3 stars bad by any means or 4 stars bad by any means, but these aren't the 5-star best player, number 1 player in their state, the country, etc. kind of guys. They're taking these guys and turning them into NFL draft picks. And with that talent, again, which isn't quite the same as others, they were still first in total defense, 4th in red zone defense, 1st in scoring defense, 4th in turnovers generated. Like, they were an awesome defense, obviously, and we've seen that. Their 3 biggest games to close out the season against Iowa, Alabama, and Washington. Granted, Iowa is not exactly a high-octane offense, but still, in those 3 games, they only gave up 11 points per game. So when it absolutely mattered, the defense only gave up 11 points per game in those 3 games. That's what Michigan's doing. So if you can bring that to the Chargers, now we're talking about not only the players that they're going to draft, but the ones that they have drafted, that they have paid. Deion Henley, how much better does he get now if they decide to bring in Jesse Minter? JT Woods, right now he's the safety 2 on the team. He is a starter as of right now. How much better is he going to get? How much higher can his ceiling be, or how much higher really can his floor be because of Minter? Things like that. Derwin James. I mean, I'm not saying that he's going to be what Kyle Hamilton has been for the Ravens this past year, but before Kyle Hamilton, it was Derwin James, and everyone wanted Kyle Hamilton to be the next Derwin James. Hamilton, of course, I think has at this point surpassed Derwin James, but there is a world where Derwin James gets back to being who we all fell in love with that rookie season, and I think Minter could be the guy to do that the same way McDonald has done that for the Ravens. So again, great option here, not official, but I do think should they go this route, it would be fantastic for the team.
Yeah, I think overall this would be a really strong step in the right direction. Jesse Minter and Mike McDonald obviously came up in the same tree under Wink Martindale for the most part, and the 2 of them have taken their own spin on the Wink defense, which is obviously a lot of pressure, a lot of simulated pressures, and we can get into specific numbers here in a minute. But it's this idea to make things extremely difficult on the quarterback, and that's what Jesse Minter and Mike McDonald have done such a great job of. It's why Mike McDonald was, one of the hottest head coaching candidates in this cycle. It's why he was one of the best defensive coordinators. It's why Jesse Minter was one of the best defensive coordinators at the University of Michigan. And it's again this philosophy that we're going to make things difficult on you, and we're going to maximize our own abilities to get after, our own development. And like Tyler is saying, so I think this is a really strong step in the direction for what you want, what everybody envisions of, the next stage of defense. Like, we've had this little hot streak, if you will, of like the Vic Fangio defense. And now it seems like we're kind of getting back to pressure and simulated pressures, and let's like heat up quarterbacks, and let's make sure that we are making things as difficult as possible on them. And Mike McDonald, Jesse Minter are kind of like the next guys in that group. So I'm really excited about this. I think from a schematic standpoint, you look at kind of the biggest differences here. Mike McDonald at Michigan, at least, ran more cover 0 and more cover 1. He was able to, I think, take a little bit more chances because that Michigan defense had David Ojabo and Aiden Hutchinson. Jesse Minter never really had both of those guys. There was always one really quality edge rusher, but he didn't have those 2 guys who I both had as top 15 grades. Aiden Hutchinson was the highest pass rusher on my board that year. And he's certainly become a star in with the Lions. So, Mike McDonald was able to take more chances at Michigan, and I think that shows out in the numbers. But the interesting thing here to me is the simulated pressure numbers in particular. Jesse Minter ran simulated pressures on 36.4% of their dropbacks this past season, and Mike McDonald at Michigan, his season was 25%. So again, Jesse Minter really believes in muddying up the picture. Let's make things as difficult as possible up front. Let's make your offensive line think at every single turn, and then let's try and heat up your quarterback as much as we can. So I think his defense is perfect for what skill sets the Chargers have. You mentioned Derwin James. I think Tuli Tuipulotu is
Mm-hmm.
perfect for this kind of defense because he can drop into coverage, because he can rush over the middle, because he can be your edge rusher. He can push the pocket. This Tuli is such a versatile piece that he's going to be perfect in Jesse Minter's defense. Again, assuming that is the decision here. But you have your core pieces in Derwin and Tuli. The rest of your roster kind of needs to be figured out. But that's a pretty great place for Jesse Minter to start out, and I think both of those guys would be moved around a lot and play extremely fast and impact the football at a really high level.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I know that that you don't need to have the number one defense, and I don't expect the Chargers to have the Ravens defense in a year. It's not that simple. It's not going to be that quick at the very least. But I am excited for the prospect that the Chargers are going to have a defense that, again, as we sort of joked about with the special teams, look, just get Justin Herbert, or just get this unit to the 20s, like, or heaven forbid it's 16th in the league. Just get them there, and this team would win several more games than they did last year. So if Minter can bring even 2/3 of what McDonald was able to bring to the Ravens, the Chargers are going to be very, very good very, very soon.
Yeah, and I don't want it to be like you're talking about average be in the 20s. The Chargers defense is going to have some turnover. Like there's going to be a very young group, in my opinion, maybe some cheap veterans here and there. This isn't going to be like the 2018 defense that had all these guys hitting the primes of their careers at the same time, and just everybody's making plays. This isn't going to be Sean Merriman and Sean Phillips and everybody hitting their prime at the same time back in the day. Like there are going to be some lumps next year, but I think Jesse Minter can maximize the talent, whatever talent he has, use some chess pieces. Maybe Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa stick around. We'll see. And the pieces are there for them to be at least better than what they were last year. That's the floor for me is kind of low 20s. I think would be great. Obviously, anything better than that, I'm not gonna rule that out because I think Jesse Minter is a great coordinator, and the Chargers could certainly revamp this thing in a hurry. But I'm definitely not expecting like number one defense right away from a potential defensive shakeout.
How dare you? How dare you keep realistic expectations and not demand excellence right away? What I think too, and I was definitely worried about this watching the game, and I think Chargers fans were a bit worried. They were watching the game against the Chiefs and the Ravens and the Chiefs in the AFC Championship game. Yes, the Ravens did end up losing. Sure, they gave up 17 points, but early on, everything was working for the Chiefs.
Yeah.
And suddenly, things were not working for the Chiefs, and things were just off a little bit. There was more pressure. Mahomes was consistently hit, and I don't believe they scored in the second half.
No,
They
0
didn't score
points.
a single point in the second half. Like, can we just imagine that for a second? Like Chargers fans, think of every Chargers Chiefs game you've watched outside of the two Arrowhead wins. And I think I don't recall exactly what it was, but I believe the Chargers have had a lead before this season in like all 6 of their games going into half, and they were 1-5 or whatever it was. The idea, the thought that the Chargers, I'm not saying this is going to happen immediately, but just the potential for the Chargers to blank the Chiefs in the second half, like that is pretty awesome. I'm excited for that. Again, it's very early. It is the off season. Got to see these things happen. Got to see a hire, but it is very exciting.
Yeah, I think you can pinpoint the opposite half, but same kind of deal against Alabama in the Rose Bowl. I mean, the Alabama Crimson Tide were coming off of this amazing, undefeated SEC season. Jalen Milroe was getting a ton of Heisman hype. People were talking about that group being Nick Saban's best offense and his best coaching job, and they completely shut them out in the first half. Like Alabama had to completely abandon any kind of traditional passing offense that they wanted. It became run heavy. It became zone read, RPO. Like they had to just like say, hey, like we're not even going to try to do deep dropbacks because your defense is too good. And that was against Alabama. Again, one of the best offenses in the country. What they did against Michael Penix. And we had Trevor Sikkema on the show last week talking about Rome Odunze being a potential pick at number 5 overall. And he had a good game. He's a great player. But that Washington offense looked like a shell of itself. I watched a ton of Washington football this year. I did not see a single defense play as good against them as Michigan did in the national championship. So it's just the ability to make things difficult. You want to be a run-heavy team, we're going to load the box, and our guys are going to beat you up. You want to be a pass heavy team? We're going to muddy up the picture up front. Our corners and our safeties are going to fly around and make plays. It's such a fun unit to watch. I've started to really watch them because of the draft prospects and obviously because of Jim Harbaugh now. That defense flies around every single play. Everybody makes plays. Everybody's into it. I'm super excited about the possibilities here that Jesse Minter can bring to the Chargers because of the culture, the identity, the schematics, everything just fits with what I envision as like the next era of Chargers football going forward.
And just that flexibility is so key. We've heard it from the locker room, from the quotes that have come out, just on the lack of flexibility. And that's kind of been organizational, I feel like, from top to bottom, whether that's, GM, whether that's head coach, whether that's coordinators, whatever. The lack of flexibility, the inflexibility has not been great for a lot of players. And some players just are like, look, hey, we got to change this. We got to do something different. And I just think being able to adapt to the players that you have and be player friendly, not try to just force the scheme or force these certain concepts, rather just adapt to the players is so huge.
Yeah, 100% there. All right, we've kind of hinted at it here. We wanted to have a discussion about how soon the Chargers could become contenders under Jim Harbaugh, Jesse Minter, Joe Hortiz. Again, hypothetically, theoretically, not official yet. So that's the conversation we want to finish the show today with, is how soon can the Chargers become contenders? We're going to qualify this as like the divisional round. Like how soon can the Chargers potentially get to the divisional round? Because that's, kind of the final 8. Those are the best 8 teams in each conference there. And I wanted to kind of, my brain first went to like, okay, everybody's making the comparison between the 49ers in 2011 and the Chargers, what they could be in 2024. I do kind of want to push back on that a bit because just from a roster construction standpoint, it doesn't really line up. So if you go back and look at the 2011 49ers, the majority of the core of that team that Jim Harbaugh took over was already in place. And Delaney Walker, who was a part of that piece, a great tight end for them, and obviously the Tennessee Titans after that, he spoke on Bussin' with the Boys, the Barstool podcast, and he made the point that the group, the talent was all there. The culture was what needed to be reset. Jim Harbaugh had to come in and get everybody to buy in, everybody to, really believe that they could take that next step as a team. It was not the roster. The roster did not need to be reset. You look at Alex Smith, Frank Gore, Vernon Davis, Delaney Walker, I mentioned, Joe Staley, Patrick Willis, Michael Crabtree, Mike Upati, Justin Smith, Ahmad Brooks, Navarro Bowman. Those guys were all there already, and that's the core of the 49ers team that made that push. The only real addition that made a strong impact that year that Jim Harbaugh selected was Aldon Smith. So it's a very different situation for me because the Chargers are, we've talked about, in kind of a stage of flux. There's a lot of veteran pieces that are potential cut candidates or will be free agents. There's not like a core of 10 players that's going to carry over from last season to this season. So I wanted to make that distinction because people are talking about it. And obviously it's extremely relevant that Jim Harbaugh can do that and has done that everywhere he's been. But the comparison to me is like maybe from a record standpoint, like they were 6-10 and the Chargers were 5-12. But from the roster standpoint, this is a very different situation that Jim Harbaugh is inheriting this season for the Chargers.
We don't even know what the vision is for the team. We discussed previously, hey, they could just trade several players and acquire as many young rookie picks as they can, but really make that push in 2025 when a lot more contracts are off the books, less dead money, etc. They genuinely themselves could be looking at 2025 and going, hey, that's when we're really going to make the push. One thing I do want to add, which I think is important, is that the best team in the NFC West in 2010, before the 49ers got there in terms of record, was the Seahawks, with a record of 7-9. The Kansas City Chiefs are going to the Super Bowl for the 47th time in the last 12 years. It's a very different division. Yeah. And it wasn't until 2012 that the Seahawks finally had their winning record, because the next year in 2011, the next best team, I believe, was 8-8, and that was the Cardinals. And then the Seahawks started to make their push, and they eventually overtook the 49ers. So it's also a very different division. So we're talking about, do the Chargers make, the top 8 here? Do they make that the 8 that finish out the conference? I don't really know, or each conference, I should say, I don't know that the Chargers are going to do that as easily as some might hope because of the Chiefs. It is not quite the same situation. The 49ers were primed to take the jump in their division because there wasn't really anybody else. Again, 7-9 was the best record that year for someone else in the NFC West. The Chargers have the Chiefs in their division. We'll see about the Broncos. We'll see about the Raiders. But, I want the Chargers to do well. Of course, I hope they win the division this year. But that nod does go to the Chiefs until proven otherwise. They're in the Super Bowl again. They've been their 6th straight AFC championship. So I think that basically I'm priming this and what we're about to talk about with, I don't think the Chargers win the division. So I think we're talking about sneaking in as a wild card team and then seeing if they can win one of those wild card games.
Yeah, I think that's a much more realistic expectation for where this team is going to be at in 2024. Again, that's a drastic improvement of making the playoffs and like thinking that they could really do some damage in the playoffs of where we were at 2 months ago, 3 months ago, obviously. So Jim Harbaugh is a great coach. We just talked about Jesse Minter. We just talked about Joe Hortiz. I'm not putting anything past this group, but the roster, to me, like, it needs to be discussed that this is not. Everybody's talking, media wise, about the roster from last season being this great veteran-laden roster. It's not going to be the same. The roster is going to have a lot of turnover. They're going to have to hit on some young guys. Can they do that? Absolutely. We just talked about Joe Hortiz and his ability to play the board and hit on some young guys. So that is why, like, my brain is like, okay, can they contend? Okay, let's talk about the roster first. The second thing that I think is worth mentioning is, like, what does that really look like for the NFL? The easiest way to do that for the Chargers is to have a bona fide, legitimate top 10 offense. I know that there's still a lot of, like, defense win championships, and the defense certainly played some great football this past weekend. The easiest way to make sure that you are playing football in the division round is to have a top 10 offense. If you look at the numbers from an EPA per play standpoint and a success rate standpoint, the only team that was not at least borderline top 10 in terms of offensive potential that was in the division round was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But the Buccaneers were so good at hitting on explosive plays with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, all those guys, that they were really, like, flirting with that line. Everybody else was at least, like, at the top 10 range or higher. Even the Chiefs, who appeared to have, like, this very average offense all season, they were 11th in EPA per play and success rate. So that's the number from an offensive standpoint. The question is obviously, what do the Chargers have to do to get there, and how realistic is that possibility next season?
That's a really good question, and that is impossible to really answer at this point until we see what happens. What happens at center? What happens at wide receiver? What happens at tight end? What happens at running back? That there's so much the Chargers have to figure out that it's a question that we can definitely address again, and we will address again after the draft, after free agency, during the summer at some point when we see how some of these injuries, play out, how people return, etc. So that is definitely one. One thing I do need to bring up, and I think that I'm sure we're all thinking the same thing. The good news about not being very good one season is that you get to play the NFL worst schedule in terms of you are the division quote unquote loser. Therefore, you get to play that schedule, and it benefits the Chargers tremendously that they will play 10 games against teams who finished 14th or worse. I would say picking 14th or higher, but the Panthers don't own their pick. So I will say they'll play 10 games against teams who finished 14th or worse. And it really helps them that half of their road games are against teams that are going to be who finished bottom 8 in the NFL. So there's a lot going on their schedule. Some teams, new coaches, the Panthers, the Patriots, the Falcons, the Titans. These are all teams that are going to be picking top 8. They've got new coaches, or they're trying to find new coaches. The Chargers really do, I think, have a bit more of an advantage here because of Jim Harbaugh. It's very different, and this is why you spend the money. There are first-time head coaches with their franchises, and they're coaches entering their first year with these franchises. And then there's Jim Harbaugh entering his first year with the Chargers. It is just very different. And you have someone like Hortiz, who, sure, first-year GM, long-time guy in the NFL with a lot of success. Yeah. These sort of things, these pairings are going to do well for the Chargers. So, if they hit in the draft, I do think they're going to be pretty good. How close, we'll see. Chargers fans I polled them. 2,000 fans responded in the poll, and they said the Chargers would be contenders in 2024, or I should say 55% said the Chargers would be consistent playoff contenders starting in 2024, and 40% of them said 2025. So I guess we got to ask the question then, Steven, where are you at?
Yeah, I think Jim Harbaugh made himself very clear on Sunday on CBS why he came back to the Chargers. He's coming back to win a Super Bowl, and that's the bar for him to reach. How long that takes, we'll see. Obviously, winning the Super Bowl is extremely difficult. But to me, if you're asking me how soon can the Chargers reach the divisional round, I think it would be 2024, but it's going to take a lot of things to go their way. You have to hit on some draft picks. You have to get some veterans in here on the cheap who can maximize their contract. Is it possible? 100%. You mentioned the schedule. Jim Harbaugh is going to have a coaching advantage every single week for the most part. On the Chargers schedule, they're going to have a quarterback advantage for the most part every single week on their schedule. Is it possible that they look at that schedule and they can go, 11-6? Probably. I think that's a realistic outcome. Is it a season that I want to bet on that they make the divisional round on? I'm probably going to say no, and I know that's probably going to make people unhappy. But I just think, like I mentioned, the roster is going to really undergo some overcorrections, shall we say, to the point where it's going to look very, very different, heading into 2024. I think from a roster standpoint, the goal is to have that roster ready to rock in 2025. Again, Jim Harbaugh, Justin Herbert, definitely, Rashawn Slater, maybe Keenan Allen, we'll see there. Maybe Mike Williams sticks around, we'll see there. This core of offense can certainly reach that number. It can certainly win you some games. I don't know if I'm going to predict that to happen right now. Playoffs, yes, I'm on board with them being a playoff team in 2024. But winning a playoff game, making it to the division round or further, I'm not there quite just yet. I need to see how the offseason goes before I can make that declaration.
Yeah, I think you and I are in agreement that we will pick them to make the postseason in some capacity. I think that's what Jim Harbaugh does. I can't be doing handstands and cartwheels and praising everybody and all these acquisitions and then say they're going to miss the postseason. We're excited for a reason, and Jim Harbaugh is that reason. So yes, I do believe the Chargers will make the postseason in 2024. You have Justin Herbert. You're going to be good. And I think what they lose in terms of players, because several players are going to be gone. That is the nature of the salary cap being real, roster turnover, new regimes, etc. But what they lose in those players that go, they make up for in the maximization of the players on their roster, whether that's coaching, whether that's a new facility, whether it's the strength and conditioning coach, whether it's the new money poured into an analytics department, whatever. Those things are going to matter. So we could see, like, you take this exact same group and give them to another very high qualified first-year head coach, and I think we're seeing something different. I genuinely believe with all the turnover that this team does not make the postseason in 2024, but you have Jim Harbaugh, and that is an advantage the Chargers have not had in a very, very long time. And I just think the maximization of your roster, where, like you said, they're finding hidden ways to win in the draft, or they're going to be the toughest team. And, Jim Harbaugh would track how many reps in practice that their team would do and say, no one else is doing more than the 49ers. Like, that is Jim Harbaugh. They're going to win every day, every second, every minute. And Jim Harbaugh wants it so bad. Like he said, there's no Lombardi trophy in college football. All that dude wants is a championship. And I think he's the perfect pairing for a quarterback who just wants to freaking win. He just wants to go out there and win. That's all he wants. It's football and it's winning. He wants to do that. They've got a coach who can definitely bring that. So I agree. Playoffs in 2024. Can they win at a game and get to the divisional round? I think yes. That slightly depends on who they're playing. There's a lot of really good teams out there, of course, in the AFC. And really, the AFC is up in the air right now. How many quarterbacks were not playing, or how many good teams missed the postseason because the quarterback got hurt? But I agree with you. The Chargers will make the playoffs in 2024 as long as everyone stays relatively healthy, of course, and Justin Herbert's out there. I feel good about the team, and I feel even better in 2025.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the coaching standpoint, because there were first-time head coaches that I would have been pretty excited about, but that changes the trajectory of the team. Like, we're talking about all this roster turnover, but I'm still expecting them to be a playoff team because of Jim Harbaugh, because of Joe Hortiz, because of Justin Herbert. Lots of JHs going around. Fun fact. But I think this trio of men, if you will, have the goods to be able to take them to that playoff step and see what happens. To me, the real like contender, like that's 2025 when the Chargers could have more money, more picks, a year in the system, all that stuff. Playoff team in 2024, potential Super Bowl threat in 2025. That to me is the goal. That's the timeline. If this were a first year coach, you're probably talking about like, hey, let's be a little frisky, like 7-10 next year and be a playoff team in 2025. But this is Jim Harbaugh we're talking about. This is a playoff team in 2024, potential Super Bowl threat in 2025.
Yeah. Let's assume the Chiefs get the number 1 seed next year. Sure, why not? They're in the Super Bowl. So let's assume they get the number 1 seed. Would I pick the Chargers to then go win in Baltimore, win in Buffalo, these places? Probably not. I think you have to respect what those teams are able to do and how far they get in the postseason typically. So yeah, I don't know if they would go beat the AFC juggernauts right now, but you never know. That fourth team that wins the division that maybe isn't so great, you happen to play that team, then maybe.
Yeah, whoever wins the AFC South is going down. That's going to totally age well.
Oh, boy.
But man, it's an exciting day. Like I mentioned, the season is going to look so different. There's a lot of change on the horizon, I think, for the better. All of these things coming together at the same time that the new facility is opening up in El Segundo feels really almost poetic to me. I'm just like, I'm so excited. This season was such a frustrating season. I know all of you listening feel that same way, but it's been quite the reward over the last week. It's been a fun ride. We podcasted like basically every day last week, live streaming with all of you. It's been a great turnout. The Chargers did that awesome video featuring our reactions alongside some other great Chargers content creators. So it's been a ton of fun to cover. I know most of you have had a lot of fun, searching everything on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, and all that stuff too. So exciting times ahead for sure. Tyler, any final thoughts before we head out today?
As a biology major and having done research before, I'm something of a scientist myself. And I've gone through all the research and I've just kind of had a little side project, right? And I was really trying to answer the question because I really want to do the research here of, who has it better than us? And after going through all the research and reading all the articles, it turns out the answer is nobody.
Nice little Spider-Man reference there at the end.
Thank you.
I love to see it. That video that the Chargers released today where he said the nobody for the first time in Powder Blues, that was an excellent touch by the Chargers social media page. Just fantastic work there. So thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Thank you to Eddie and Greg for producing as always. Appreciate you guys for subscribing, liking, all that good stuff. Don't forget to take a moment and subscribe to our own channel to get the Get Charged podcast as well. We appreciate you. We'll see you next time. As always, Bolt Up.